really your opportunity to make sure none of your people get missed in the next census. And it happens right now. It happens, the registration packets were just mailed for it, and the actual work will begin in early 2018. It's a small time commitment for potentially big payoffs for your community. So I want to tell you a little bit more about that program and talk about, in general, just why we should care about the census. I know it's 3 years away. I do want you to understand that at the federal level, there is some serious funding shortfalls for the census, and you know there's funding shortfalls all around. This is something that we're required to do. It's in our Constitution to take a census every 10 years. But what you see for Census 2020 is the yellow line there. We aren't seeing the ramp up in this fiscal year that we typically would see. And this year is when we would, the Census Bureau would typically do an end-to-end test, like a dress rehearsal test, to make sure that all the systems that they typically use to count everyone in the US are working well. Because they didn't receive that ramp up in funding, they were required to reduce the number of tests, the dress rehearsals that they usually do, from 3 to 1. And the 2 that they dropped were in rural areas and in Indian reservations. So what remained was 1 urban test site, which leaves open the door for potentially concern for rural areas. So at the federal level, there's issues going on. And so what we're doing in the state to try to counteract that is to do absolutely everything we can do to make sure that the census has the best data to go off of. And they don't need to do a whole lot of outreach to have the compliance that they would need from states. The census is about power, money, and data. It's about political power, how we redistrict, both at the congressional level, at the federal level, and at the state legislative district level. It's about money, and I'm going to tell you exactly what I mean by that, which programs are affected by census counts. And then you all know that the data that come out of the census are used on a regular basis to make good, smart decisions about your communities. So in 2010, the gray states on this map kept their the same number of congressional seats that they had in 2000. Minnesota has 8, and that was, we held on to that 8th seat. Again, this time around, that's a big concern that we'll lose one of our congressional districts and have to go down to 7. You can see the states that lost are kind of in that orange color, and the states that gained seats are in blue there. And so it's typical of the Midwestern states that they've been not growing as quickly as other states. Minnesota's been growing, and it's been growing well compared to our Midwestern neighbors, but it's nowhere near the growth that some of the other states in the Southwest and in the South, such as Texas and Florida, are receiving. So that's how the redistribution of seats happens. It's just where the population growth is. So what we need to do this time, and especially for greater Minnesota districts, is be sure that we count every single person that we possibly can to keep the size of the districts as small as they possibly can be. This time there have been some people that have done some projections to say who is on the short list for potentially losing seats, and Minnesota makes that short list, that we would potentially lose 1 along with Illinois, Michigan, New York, Ohio, and you can see on the left there are the states that are gaining. Similar to the map, similar to what I showed you just a moment ago. The states in the South and the Southwest have been growing rapidly, and we're truly at risk of losing a congressional seat this time. So the question is, just looking at a map, here are our districts. What would that map look like with 1 less district? I mean, can the greater Minnesota districts that we see here What does that do if they need to expand any further than they've already expanded? That may need to happen anyway, but this is going to be an important dimension of how Greater Minnesota is represented in Washington. And so I just show you the map to drive home what does that look like if we have one less. For me, it's concerning, and we have work to do right now in order to keep just as much political power as we are due. It's worth mentioning, I think, that the state legislative districts are drawn on census data as well, and as just as with the congressional districts, you know, when you have fewer people counted, the geographic size of the district grows. And so it's really in people's best interest to keep it as small as possible, to keep those interests local. And even at the state level, that's going to be an issue. And the count is based on the redistricting process at the state level is based on these census counts as well. I want to talk about the money now. How is census tied to money? More than $400 billion each year are distributed by the feds to state and local governments on the basis of census dollars. And in Minnesota, our specific number is about $1,500 a year, or $15,000 over the course of the decade, just for finding one additional person in your community that otherwise wouldn't be counted. Now, it doesn't necessarily go specifically to your community, but that's kind of the aggregate of all the funds that flow to the state. That's the dollar amount, around $1,500 a year or $15,000 over the course of the next decade. So any work you do to find even a marginal improvement in your census count really has potentially big payoffs, and they add up very, very quickly. Here's some examples of some of the programs that are funded based on census formulas. We have Medicaid, highway planning and construction, SNAP, Medicare, Section 8, these are federal examples. LGA, so part of the LGA formula is based on the population estimates that come out of my office, and we anchor those to the census count each decade. So if your census count is higher, it flows through, I know it's one part of many parts of this formula, but it flows through, it has an impact on how much LGA money your community would receive. Community ed funding, small cities development grants that come out of DEED, trunk highway fund, these are all different examples, and there are many, many other examples of how local money is tied to the census count. And so if you can get it right now and do the work any work that you possibly can give now toward this effort can pay dividends into the next decade and beyond. It's about data too, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. What can you do right now? The first thing I want to tell you what you can do is that you can register for the LUCA program, the Census Bureau's local update of census addresses. Has anyone received this letter yet? Oh, that's so good. You would have received it in the last couple of weeks, and I'm so glad to hear that because I hadn't talked to anyone who had gotten it yet. And I want you to know that's not junk mail that's coming from the Census Bureau. That's something that I really encourage you to register for. It is voluntary, but again, the payoffs for participating and making sure your number is right could be very substantial to your community. So the highest elected official should receive in your jurisdiction. So if you're the mayor, which I assume you all are, you should have received it or will be receiving this letter soon. If you haven't received it or don't receive it in the next week or so, get a hold of me and we'll try to track down where that went. The Census Bureau is having you register only through this mail out, mail back registration process. You can't go online anywhere. It's just, you got to track down that form and fill it out and send it back, and then you'll be registered to take part in this program. So what is the program, it's basically you have someone in your city look at the address list and compare it against the address list that you may have access to and make sure the Census Bureau isn't missing anyone. Make sure that they don't have any of your addresses that are in your neighbor's city, that you have all the addresses that you should have and that none are missed. It's of particular concern when there are new housing developments, when there are maybe units that are unusual, they're not standalone units. There are a number of different hard to count populations. Sometimes in rural areas, if you don't have a city style address system, it can be very difficult for the Bureau to put on the map just what jurisdiction that address is in. And so it's up to you all to make sure that what they have is what they should have. Again, it's a voluntary program, but it's something that potentially could save you money in the long run to put a little time toward this. And I should say at this time, it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge project. You don't have to meet about it for, weeks on end. You can find someone who knows your data, and it can be as little as a review that takes, a half a day or a day or something. This is just, if someone really knows your data and if they have some of the technical skills that they might need, they can run a quick check on this and quickly identify the areas where they're not lining up with the Census Bureau's data. For some of the larger cities, I'm not guaranteeing half a day of work, but I just want you to know that it doesn't necessarily have to be a tremendously huge project. This is just an example of a new housing development. This one happens to be in the Twin Cities in Bloomington, but you can see if you have a unit that has if you have a housing unit with 400 units and about 600 residents, that's $8.4 million to state and local funds in our state. So if you just find that one building, or the same is true of group quarters. We'll have a group quarters process too, and group quarters are prisons and they're college dormitories and places, assisted living, nursing homes. If you just find that one unit that's a larger unit, it potentially has a lot of impact overall on funding formulas between 2020 and 2030. So as best I can tell, because I haven't received my registration form yet, it's something the state can do as well, and it's something that counties can do as well. This is what the form should look like. Is it, for those of you who have received this, and maybe some of you have opened it, does it look similar? You got the green bars? Yep, okay, great. So you should have received this or be receiving this. The county, highest elected official in the county will be receiving it as well. And you can coordinate with your counties to see who's doing what. And that's something that we would be happy to help facilitate for different regions of the state too, just to coordinate the checking. So the important dates for LUCA are that the packets are just getting mailed out now. You have until December 15th to mail that back. If you do it earlier, it helps us out a little bit because we can help coordinate and let you know who else in your area is doing this kind of checking. If your county's doing it, or if you're not able to do it, if you let us know, we can make sure that your county can do it. And the actual review, you have three months in February to do that checking of your list against the Census Bureau's address list. If you can't participate in the LUCA because you just don't have the staff or you don't have the data in a format that makes it doable, we're planning to do a check of as many communities as we possibly can across the state. And we will be relying on some of the Next Gen 911 data. And so this is another way that you can help us, help you, is by participating in this roll-up of data. This is something that's being done at the state level. Some of you may be aware of this data sharing program. But you can see here that the green counties that are shown on this map are the counties for which there's full address coverage right now in the state level database. If you're in a yellow county, it means there's partial coverage. Some of the cities have rolled up their data for their address level data for the state, and others have not. In the gray areas, there's no coverage, at least right now. Again, this is a state level project that's ongoing. Eventually, we hope that the whole state will be green, but right now this is the state of the coverage. And to the extent that we have coverage, we can help with some of that checking, but if we don't have the data, we don't have anything to check against with the Census Bureau's data. Okay, so 3 things you can do, even though it says 1, 2, 1. Let's pretend that last one's 3. 3 things you can do to improve the census count right now. Make sure that you register for that LUCA program when you get the registration form. You can connect with us, with my office. You can go to our website, which is mn.gov/demography, or you can go straight to this tiny URL. I think my URL dropped off. Tiny URL, it should say .com/Minnesota Census. And that's just a way that you can tell us that, yes, I am participating, and here's my contact person. Here's my GIS person, or here's my person who knows address data, and then we can help coordinate between cities and between the counties. And just as a preview, next year we will be doing work to start doing outreach activities in Minnesota to get to hard to reach populations. So right now we're just making sure that we have all the address data and everything that we need administratively. We're going to pivot at the beginning of next year and think about who are our hard to count populations and how can we reach them eventually. But that's just a heads up that that's coming. I think that was the end of my show. The last thing I wanted to tell you was thank you very much for letting me have this extended commercial here, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Yeah?
So you're basing this on addresses that cities and counties have right now. So we have the new assisted living center going up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And new housing going up in the next 2 years.
Yeah.
How does it get in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so there are 2 separate programs within the Census Bureau's operations for Census 2020. And one program, which I described to you, is for all the existing housing up to 2018, March of 2018. After that, there's a new construction program that will look specifically at everything that's being built after that point. So there's a whole separate program that will look at that, but they won't go back if they find something after 2018 and say, oh, we missed this one. And so potentially you could lose out if you don't bring it up to date by 2018 March. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
We have a lot of cities that have college campuses like Bemidji, Marshall, Moorhead, Mankato, etc. There seem to be a lot of problems in a couple of the other census issues.
Yeah.
How do those communities that have mayors or administrators here specifically handle that? Because my understanding is they're supposed to be in the census count if they're in the dormitories, and there's kind of a disconnect of when the kids move in and leave and when there's breaks. And what's your recommendation for those of us who have college students to maximize those numbers for our population counts?
One of the programs that the Census Bureau will be doing when it's time to do the outreach is something called Census on Campus. And so it's educating students and administrators and city officials that the dormitories are the places where the kids should be counted, not at home with their parents, if they live in the dormitories for most of the time. That's the rule. Which presumably they do. I don't know of any, I guess it could be a very short-term stint at a dormitory, but in general, they should be counted there. And so there will be an effort to reach out to folks who will need to know that. So it will be administrators of the schools, of the nearby cities. There's also a program that looks specifically at the group quarters, like we said, and so we will be going to identify before that time just where the group quarters are. We already have a list, but we'll be verifying with you all that it looks right to you as well, and to the universities, to the various campuses. If you have specific suggestions for me how to do that best, I'm wide open to suggestions, because this is my first time doing this, and I want to do it as best as we possibly can. Ultimately, the responsibility of the count is with the Census Bureau, but I want to make sure it goes as smoothly in Minnesota as possible. And so if you have any key contacts that I should be talking to, or any suggestions for how to get that message out, I am all ears. Yeah.
How might we count a prison that houses illegal immigrants?
A prison housing illegal immigrants should be counted in the census. The census counts everyone regardless of their legal status to be in the U.S. So it includes unauthorized immigrants, whether they're in prison or outside of prison. They should be counted. It's just residents. It's not counting citizens. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So this is Minnesota, and thousands of our seniors leave and go south.
Yeah.
And so the date is where you live on April 1st or something like that. So they're not living here April 1st, but
Yeah.
they're Minnesota citizens and they go here and pay taxes here. What's the rule on where they can taxes?
Well, the residence criteria is actually not where they are on April 1st, but where they generally live. You can be if you're at a temporary location, they want where you live most of the year. So if those snowbirds are living in Florida or California for more than they live here, they really should be counted in Texas or California. We might not make that super well known. I'm just kidding. But we will certainly let them know if they're in Minnesota that they should be counted right here in Minnesota. If the majority of the year is here in Minnesota. And we will reach out to networks. You know, there are networks in Arizona that count Minnesota, or that get to Minnesotans through newsletters and so forth. We'll do our best to reach them there and let them know. Yeah. I am out of time here, and I know you all have a meeting. Some of you have a meeting. I'm happy to take questions. I'll be around some this evening at the dinner and so forth. So please come ask me if you have any questions, and thank you very much.